Welcome to Jargon, a podcast bringing clarity to commonly misunderstood business concepts. We're debunking and simplifying the buzzwords and ideas plaguing today's business world and offering a fresh perspective on these topics. This is Peter Purcell.
And Bill Imany.
Welcome to the latest podcast. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about cost reduction.
Yeah, and before we dive into that too much, what we're hearing a lot about are a lot of layoffs that are happening basically due to our economic conditions. A lot of companies are realizing that the pressures from inflation, the pressures from the economy are causing them to really look at their cost structure and rationalize it. And frankly, they start laying off people. We're seeing a lot of those trends across various industries.
Right, and I've talked to a number of friends of mine who work for a variety of companies, and they've been given targets of up to 20% reduction.
Yeah, and I find it kind of amusing. These companies will come out and go, okay, we're going to across the board, we're going to cut 20%, but they have no idea what they're going to do. So they just basically go out to the organization and say, okay, let's look at our overhead and administrative costs, and we're going to cut everything 20%. So they go to the accounting group, cut 20%. Go to IT, cut 20%. And the reality is not everybody's starting from the same place.
No. And so today we were talking over lunch a little bit about this, Bill, and you were talking about a fairly structured process that I thought we should share with our listeners.
Yeah, and it's a process we go through with a lot of our clients who are in a situation where they're trying to be proactive about cutting costs as opposed to reactive. And when I say proactive, they're actually doing it not in response to a event, but they're doing it in response to what they see coming down the pipe. So yeah, you can quickly reduce costs by just telling everybody, okay, fire 20% of your people by the end of the month. But then you have all these severance costs associated with it. The fundamental problem with that, though, before we dive into the structured approach and how companies can cut costs rationally, is the problem with the whole 20% across the board. What we find in companies, those costs end up creeping back into the organization anyway because the company really didn't examine who they were cutting and why. And all of a sudden, the work still needs to be done, and it's still there.
Right, and what I've seen is a number of companies where they'll cut 20%, and then they go off and they hire contractors to replace them because they don't count as part of headcount. And I'm like, wait a minute, did you really cut costs then?
Well, they said they were cut headcount, but they didn't cut costs because the contractors cost more than the
exactly.
Employees.
That's my point. So, you said it much better than me.
So we really work with our clients to talk about how do we go about cutting costs and what do we do. We really look at it, I'll call it from a three-step process. One is setting internal targets rationally, and we'll talk about how you go about doing that. The second piece is getting a deeper understanding of what's actually happening in the business, in the company, and that requires some digging into some things and really understanding the business drivers. And then the third one is kind of rationalizing executives. People will go, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Rationalizing executives mean maybe I have 20 VPs and I only need 10. So it's kind of that whole executive suite and the executives looking at themselves in the mirror saying, what do we need to do at the top level too?
Exactly. If everybody's going to take a haircut, everybody should have a haircut.
Right, and I know all about haircuts. So anyway, first thing, when we talk about setting internal targets, people use the word benchmark. You'll often hear people talk about, well, we benchmark this and benchmark that. The difficulty in benchmarking is I might look at an organization and say, you know what, your peer company's G&A is 2% lower than your G&A as a percent of revenue. The problem with those external benchmarks that companies come back with is a lot of times it's what they classify as G&A versus operating expense, and what are they capitalizing and not capitalizing. So in a lot of cases, it's not a very good comparison. So when we talk about setting targets, we actually ask an organization to really focus on their business just from a macro perspective. So for example, every company or organization has what I'll call an operating entity. And when we mean by an operating entity, let's say you're a restaurant. Your operating entity is a restaurant. If you're a restaurant that has 5,000 restaurants, you have 5,000 operating entities. If you're a school district, you have a school, which is an operating entity. If you're a manufacturing company, you have plants that are an operating entity. Or a service company, you have maybe drilling rigs are an operating entity. But when we look at operating entities, the organization should really look back and say, okay, and I'll use the example of restaurants because everybody understands what a restaurant is. Simple example. Let's say you're a restaurant chain that has 5,000 restaurants across the country. Question the executives should ask themselves, if we just had one restaurant how many people would we need outside of the restaurant to keep the restaurant running? Okay, so inside the restaurant, you have your cooks and your
manager, your servers,
exactly,
a bartender potentially, right?
Yeah, and a cost-cutting effort, you're typically not going to cut costs at the customer service level.
No, you're not going to cut bartenders. No. Definitely not.
No, because
servers probably not.
In a down economy, probably need more bartenders. But
exactly, many more.
But really, what you're really trying to address is the support functions that support the restaurant. So you have accounting, purchasing, human resources, marketing, legal, IT, facilities, engineering, or even a real estate department, all these overhead departments that support that restaurant. But if you were to say, hey, if we just had one restaurant, how many hours a week would we need of accounting? How many hours a week or people would we need to provide HR payroll? And so we've gone through this exercise with other companies in different industries where they've looked at those and said, okay, I probably need half a bookkeeper to do my accounting for a restaurant. Maybe I need a half of a purchasing person, and then I need a full-time HR person to take care of HR payroll. And then I probably need somebody to do marketing and technology type stuff. So maybe you add it up and you go, you know what? I really just need 3 people in the back office to support that restaurant and keep it running as a single restaurant entity. So the 5,000, or I'll say the 5,000 restaurant chain would say, okay, so in the back office, I just need 3. That means I need 15,000 people in the back office. But they look at the organization and go, wait a minute, we have 30,000 people in the back office supporting that 5,000 restaurant chain. So looking at that and benchmarking that and saying, where are my big gaps? So you might dive in and look at your accounting organization and go, why do we have 5 times as many people or 2 times as many people that we need to support this operation? And what are we doing unique? And what value are we adding to justify that increased headcount, if that makes sense?
So you're talking about really building kind of a bottom-up model, if you will. And when I say bottom-up, is start with your revenue-generating entity or function or whatever.
Operating entity, yeah.
The operating entity, that's the one that's making your money. Okay, bottom line. Back office doesn't make money. And then what does it take to support that? Because I could even throw out, you were talking about external people. I could even suggest, and not throwing a monkey wrench in this conversation, is some of that function, maybe even a manager, the restaurant manager could be doing, which again reduces the need for external resources potentially.
Yeah, exactly. So at that point, and this is kind of you're leading into the second step of this whole process, is then taking a look at those gaps and getting deeper understanding into why do we need those people to support those functions. So for example, let's say you're a global organization and you need to bring in an internal tax team to take care of a lot of international tax type issues that are basically helping you
make money
optimize
or save money.
Well, yeah, optimize your tax position.
Right.
You can rationalize that and say there's value in that. I've run into organizations where they have a huge tax department and their job is really ensuring they comply with tax laws, but also at the same time, they make the right decisions in terms of how they allocate their assets and legal entities to ensure that they're not taking on unnecessary tax liabilities.
Yeah.
So there's savings in that. But gaining a better understanding. And this goes into the whole problem when you ask someone to cut costs and you don't tell them how to get there or where they should be, using those targets, then understanding where the big gaps in the organization. Because you might find that, you know what, your IT organization, maybe they're staffed just right. But by the way, the accounting organization or your procurement department has twice as many people as we really need to operate the number of operating entities we have, be it a restaurant or drilling company or even a manufacturing company.
So as we gain a better understanding, Bill, are there specific tools or techniques that we can use to make it so it's a little more scientific and a little less like art? Right? What's the science involved in this, or is it primarily art?
Well, you bring up a good point, Peter. It's a combination of both, and I'm glad you asked that question because one of the tools we do use is called a RACI, and I think some people have heard of it, some people haven't. It's kind of a consulting word, but it's really an acronym for R for responsible, A for accountable, C consult, and I for inform. And that RACI, if you can take all your business processes and map them against who is responsible and accountable for different business processes in your organization, and you start looking at that, and the places where you start to see places where you can cut costs is when there's dual accountability and multiple responsibility for one business objective. So for example, I might have a corporate accounting department that says they're accountable for the budget. annual budget process. But then I have regional financial groups that they say they're accountable for the budget. Immediately, those are areas where I can immediately dive in and go, I have got maybe some duplication of effort going on, and I could start rationalizing that. So that's that RACI piece, or even reporting. I will tell you, organizations, they are known for producing reports for all sorts of people. So
that nobody uses.
That nobody uses. So start rationalizing reports and information and looking at, are two different people producing the same report, the profitability report? And maybe it just looks different. So those are areas where you can start looking at getting a better understanding of where you can cut the cost. But the point of all this is, don't just cut the cost, get rid of stuff. You got to get rid of stuff you're doing. A better consulting way of saying that is saying, improve your process, make the process better. But you got to get rid of stuff, okay? And that's part of that whole rationalization process. And you can lay off those people, but until you make things go away.
Till you eliminate inefficient steps in key processes or eliminate unnecessary processes, eliminating a person doesn't really help because somebody's still going to have to do the work.
Yeah, the work's still there and somebody's expecting it.
Well, let me ask you this, Bill. So as you start thinking about, we've kind of hit on process, now we're hitting on organization a little bit. And again, I'm using consulting terms. I'm going to just really light a fire here. How does working at home, working remote versus working in the office, apply in this? When you start thinking of quote unquote benchmarking and, are people really working or, whatever?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I get a kick out of this. I've seen this several times on LinkedIn where this person shows this graph, and on the left-hand side of the graph, it shows hours spent in the day working in the office. And then the right-hand side, it says hours spent in the day working from home. And the picture of them working in the office shows them commuting and eating long lunches and taking long coffee breaks and not getting much work done. The right-hand side shows this guy, or lady working from home, and they spent all day working from home, and they didn't have to commute or eat lunch or do anything. And I'll tell you this, the benchmark for knowing that's a complete lie and falsehood is there are a lot of young people out there right now who are holding multiple jobs, multiple full-time jobs that neither one knows, the companies know neither one about each other.
Yeah.
And they're able to balance that because working from home, the real graph looks like working from home, I spend 25% of my day dealing with the dog. Barking dog in the back.
Right.
I mean, how many conference calls, Peter, have you been on where you hear a dog barking?
Dog barking, right. And what are they going to be doing when they're off the conference call? I think they're off walking the dog.
Yeah, and I see a lot of people walking the dog in our neighborhood. Right. In the middle of the day.
Right. So the reason why I brought this point up, just to let you know, isn't necessarily to start a huge, argument
about dogs,
about dogs or cats for that matter. Is really the reason why I bring it up is there's this prevailing idea that if you allow people to work from home, you can actually reduce your cost and increase productivity. And so since we're talking about reducing cost, is that real or is that fiction?
No, Peter. I mean, I think there are certain jobs that are conducive to working at home.
Like customer service, call center type stuff.
Yeah, if you're not dealing with anybody else inside the organization. Now, if the people who are in positions of having to interact with other people in the company to collaborate and get things
done. On a regular basis, yes.
On a regular basis, when those are then being done at home, they lose tremendous amount of efficiency. You don't know how many times. Okay, here's the best test. Next time you're on a conference call, and someone starts talking and they forgot they're on mute, that's the first indication they were multitasking. They were not paying attention.
Exactly.
And that's an easy way of getting out of answering a question, saying, I was on mute, I didn't know, and could you repeat the question? Mm-hmm. And I'm going, well, your earphones were on mute or your brain was on mute?
And that's your point of, we talked about this earlier, systems integrators, working on multiple projects at the same time, and they may be contractors and they're working on multiple contracts at the same time. And we talked about that about 3 podcasts ago. So,
yeah. So
okay,
but I don't want to get into the work. I don't want to turn this into working from home.
No. I'm not. I'm just saying that as you were talking about taking a look at the organization, and all I was suggesting is any position that is working from home probably requires a little bit more diligence than not.
And it requires also a special person who is, I'll say, committed to the organization and committed to getting their work done. But before we finish, Peter,
no. I know. I wanted to get to executives, but I wanted to get a little lighthearted discussion going before we rationalize the executives.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to get all sorts of comments on our review post saying, working from home is great. I don't have a dog. Yeah, you probably have a kid or somebody that's distracting you, or your neighbor that comes over because he's unemployed and he's knocking on your door and asking, if he can borrow the lawnmower or something.
So the last part you were talking about was rationalize the executives, and you were using an example of companies that may be VP heavy and stuff.
Well,
like
yeah,
that.
and I was alluding to that earlier. And here's the thing: we find a lot of organizations they've had to promote people and keep them retained. So they'll, hey, let's create a new position and we'll call it VP of innovation or VP of transformation or whatever you want to call it. And all of a sudden you look at your organization and you've diluted the VP title or senior VP title. We've run into organizations where they've had, let's say a couple dozen VPs and they're all earning $500,000 per year. But the reality is, if you look at it and go, really as an organization, what do you really need? And so we actually have a kind of a view on how to rationalize your executives. And we look at it kind of in three ways. If you're going to have someone with a vice president title or even an officer title, whatever it might be, is their fiduciary accountability, risk mitigation, and how many people they're overseeing.
Okay.
So we typically provide those three layers of a test. Are they fiduciary accountability? Are they accountable for more than 30% of a company's costs, working capital, or revenue? Mm-hmm. Maybe you do need someone, a vice president or someone of that caliber doing the work. Second piece is, are they mitigating risks that are significant to the company? So, for example, I might have a VP of health, safety, environment or VP of legal because they're mitigating risks that are significant to the company and they need to have a seat at the table from an executive perspective. And so you need someone of that caliber. Okay. The third piece, are they managing a significant part of the workforce? For example, head of sales. I've got 1,000 salesmen out there going out and selling. They're in charge of a large part of the people in the organization. So really looking at it in those three prongs and saying, let's rationalize our VPs. If they have enough financial oversight, risk mitigation, or people oversight, then it warrants that. But if I have someone who maybe has two people reporting to them and they're just doing stuff in the organization that maybe it's not of strategic value or warrants a seat at the table in the boardroom, then seriously take a look at eliminating those VP positions. And those are, I hate to say it, those are relatively easy to do because typically you have visibility, direct visibility in what they do. It's more difficult to figure out how am I going to lay off a couple of tax analysts who are actually doing heavy lifting work that could only be done by them, or a big four firm that's going to cost twice as much. So I think those are the things that really need to think about.
Okay, fair enough. Fairly straightforward there. So again, if we were to step back, first thing we do is we try to understand kind of what our working unit is, right? Our operating entity, yes. The operating entity. Fix your processes, do a RACI, and then rationalize the executives.
Yeah, those are the three main points. And we talk about processes, again, it's taking a deeper dive and understanding what's really happening, what's being done out there, and seeing that time waste. Another tool we apply to that is also kind of some value stream mapping. We'll do some Six Sigma tools around that and really value stream map out processes to then identify where's the waste. So that's another tool you could be using that process piece as well.
Okay.
But you've summed it up very well, Peter.
Well, Bill, thank you for your time. I know you're very busy. You've been traveling quite a bit lately. If folks have a question for Bill, you can send him an email at bill@trinergy.com.
Or you can ask Peter at trinergy.com.
Right.
He's always eager to receive emails.
Oh, I'm always eager to receive emails. I don't answer them correctly, but anyway.
You do.